Hi, this is Claudette Milner, host of A Matter of Interpretation. First of all, I want to give honor and glory to God for getting me here safely. And then I want to move into the show. Today we're going to talk about immigration. And my purpose during this series is to show some of the faces of immigration. The guest speaker today is the legal advisor of Michigan United, and it is Diego Bonacati. And welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We want to move quickly into the show. We've got some follow-ups to do today. You can tune in for those also, but we will be live from 4 to 5. Diego, can you go ahead and give me a little bit about your background and what you actually do at Michigan United?
Sure. Well, I'm the son of Argentine immigrants. Grew up in the States, went to Michigan State University, and I work for Michigan United, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're composed of faith organizations, labor, chambers of commerce, ethnic associations. And we are licensed by the Board of Immigration Appeals to be able to offer immigration services, immigration legal services. I've been involved in the immigration field in different capacities since 1989. And I started with an organization in Chicago called what's now called the National Immigrant Justice Center. Also worked with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Helped start an organization in the suburbs west of Chicago called the West Suburban Action Project. Did a little bit of time in the private sector, and then came back to Michigan for family, and have worked with Michigan Immigrant Rights Center and Michigan United.
Okay, and I'm going to get this question out of the way and on the top, okay? First of all, were you born in the United States?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and then were your parents?
No, they were born in Argentina, and they immigrated as adults.
Okay, and what was their process?
So it's kind of odd. They immigrated pre-65, before the 1965 immigration changes, under what was called the Western Hemisphere arrangement. So if you were from a country anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, from Canada down to practically Antarctica, and you had a job offer, you could immigrate on that basis. Now, they immigrated by accident. My mother had a fellowship to do her medical residency in the States, and my father wanted to just be able to work, and they couldn't figure it out, and they had visited the consulate like 6 times. And I think the audience will recognize this is in many ways long ago, because they saw the same Foreign Service officer. And I can't imagine you could stroll into a consulate today without seeing a huge line, right? But eventually he said, you know, your fellowship has a job offer, why don't you just immigrate? And you don't necessarily have to stay if you don't want to. And that's what they did, and they decided to stay when they got here. So they really were fortunate, and the process was much easier than it is today for a lot of people.
Okay, because they're definitely not that. And the second question, and it's, I don't know, because I know people are going to ask, is it true that when immigrants come into this country, undocumented, that they get more rights than American citizens?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
It's not. I mean, first of all, let's start with one of the classic rights of a citizen. You can't vote, right? They can't vote. They can't hold office. Technically, they can't work. Obviously, we know they do. But they're not going to have, and even though they have certain protections, if they have worked, most people are not going to be able to exercise any of those protections. They don't have a right to a driver's license, or they don't have that access to that privilege. They can't join the armed forces. There's a whole slew of things. They're not eligible for far and away bulk of public benefits, except for emergency medical care. If their children are citizens, right? If their children are born here, their children they'll be eligible for benefits. One thing that minors are eligible for even if they're undocumented, is a K through 12 education until they turn 18.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask about that too. So they come in to the States, and then their children. Now, what about children that are not born in the United States? Do they also just automatically go to school?
Yeah, and that's as a result of a Supreme Court decision called Plyler v. Doe, which held that minors should not be accountable for, whatever transgressions their parents have done, and so they shouldn't be punished not going to school or unable to go to school. And so in that decision, it basically laid out that undocumented children can go to public schools.
Okay, so how does that process work? What do they use as? We know they're undocumented, so what do they use as, like registration and all of those things? How does that, what happens?
So generally, so first of all, the school district can ask for a Social Security number, but it is, if they say we don't have one, then they don't pursue it any further. They need proof that the people are they live in the district, right? So a utility bill or some sort of correspondence to their address, and they need to have the identity of the child. So it might be a passport, it might be a birth certificate with a translation to show that the child is who they say the child is.
Okay, so what happens? Parents are illegal, kids are undocumented, so when the parents come, is it just overlooked?
Overlooked by who?
Overlooked by the school, because you've got two illegals and then you've got undocumented kids.
In general, I don't see too many schools that are going to be calling immigration.
Okay.
Right? There was now that was something that the state of California had proposed in 1994 with a ballot measure called Proposition 187. And what that did is, originally it said that anybody who worked for the state would essentially be a mandated reporter if they got any sort of income through the state of California. And I think that was like teachers, it was medical care, social workers, law enforcement, all of those folks, if they came into contact with somebody, and I don't remember the details, the minutia of like how they were to ascertain whether a person had papers or not, then they would become mandated reporters. It got tied up in the courts and was found largely unconstitutional and ultimately overturned.
Okay, so we wanted to kind of go through that. Now, what exactly do you do? In my position at Michigan United, we help sort of two groups of people, and this is by status, with two procedures. We help people who are legal permanent residents, so they have green cards, they're here in the country legally, apply for citizenship and prepare to become citizens, Okay.
right? And that's the naturalization process. And we also help people who are undocumented but qualify for a program that President Obama had proposed back in 2012 called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. And if they meet those requirements, they can get temporary protection against deportation and a work permit.
And so what are those requirements?
They have to have entered the country prior to, and established a domicile in the country prior to June 15th, 2007. They have to have entered prior to the age 16. They had to have been physically present in the country on June 15th, 2012. They have to either be attending school or have graduated high school or received a GED. And they can't have most criminal convictions. The one exception is non-DUI, non-felony traffic. So if they have like a speeding ticket or something like that, they can still apply for the program.
Okay. So if one of my viewers is watching and they feel like they fit that category but they don't have a clue what this program is or how it would affect them, what kind of marketing or do you do to ensure that everybody that is eligible for the program is a recipient of the program?
Well, so generally we work on relatively small scale, right? So we're focused in the Detroit area and Kalamazoo, and we do little kind of like little circuit riding in little hamlets in West Michigan. But if people, we have a website, and that's www.miunited.org. And if people are outside our service area, we'll refer them. And perhaps we can get this to you for a following program, an immigration law help website that helps you locate nonprofit organizations that either have attorneys on staff or are licensed by the Board of Immigration Appeals the way Michigan United is. And so you can enter a zip code into this this website, and they will show you what's closest and what services those organizations offer.
Okay, so what about if you're already, and you're working towards citizenship, you're already here, what is that process?
So mostly it is a 21-page form, and you are asked in general you have to pay $680, and the reason that number, USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the branch of Homeland Security that processes paperwork, so for green cards or citizenship or work permits, they have to charge whatever it costs them to provide that service.
Okay.
Right? So none of our tax dollars actually go to USCIS. It's all fee-based. Next, a pair of photos, a photocopy of their green card, and this form. And so they have to, in order to technically qualify, they have to generally be in the country as a permanent resident for 5 years. If they're married to a citizen, and they've been married to that citizen for 3 years, they can apply with 3 years of residence instead of 5.
Okay.
And they also have to show that they're people of good moral character, that they've been physically present in the country for at least half of the times indicated. So if you're here for if you're under the 5-year requirement, you have to have been here at least 2.5 years physically in the country. They will fingerprint you as part of the process and do a security and name check. And at the same time they take your photo, and that's the photo that will go on your naturalization certificate. And at the interview, they'll review all the questions on the application, as well as occasionally something may come up from how you obtained permanent residence in the past. They may ask you questions about that, and they will give you the test. And so you have to study a 100-question universe, and you have to be able to essentially speak, read, and write English. And so the questions are about civics, government, history, geography, holidays relating to the United States. And if you pass that, then you're set up for an oath ceremony.
Okay. Now, what are the ways that you obtain legal residency?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. So the way the law looks at things, the first thing that the law does, it divides citizens from everybody else. And so there's a word that is antiquated and has now become viewed as hostile, and that is alien, right? And that's alien originally just meant foreign, right? This is long before Sigourney Weaver got in a spaceship and all that. But basically means non-citizen. So there's the citizens, and then everybody who is a non-citizen is considered to be an immigrant until they prove otherwise, right? And so when somebody walks into the U.S. consulate, the assumption in most cases, there's exceptions, but in most cases are that person intends to immigrate to the United States. And so if they apply for a temporary visa, they have to prove it otherwise. They have to prove that they'll return to their country of origin and that they don't want to set up a home here. So then we get to immigrants, you have permanent residence, And in terms of getting permanent residence, so that's just one part of the whole kind of A to Z, right, in immigration. But to get permanent residence, there's 4 main ways. Family, which is far and away the most common way, which is more than half of people who immigrate on the basis of a family relationship of somebody who is a citizen or a resident here. And those are nuclear family members, right? So your parents, your adult children, your spouse or your siblings, right, or can be your petitioners. Next is employers can petition for you sort of the way a family member might petition for you. An employer who needs someone with a particular set of skills that are lacking or that there's a shortage of in the United States. So that's a 2-step process, because first they have to demonstrate that to the satisfaction of the Department of Labor. And then once the Department of Labor confirms that there is such a shortage, then they can petition for that person. In some cases, there is a sort of a class certification. So for instance, nurses and physical therapists are, in general, there's a national shortage of those folks. There may be geographic shortages of doctors, for example. So you're going to find doctors from Pakistan and India and the Philippines in North Dakota, for example, because they have trouble keeping doctors in the state. And generally, those categories, a person has to have a bachelor's level education and 5 years experience. And I'm just reading the high points.
Right.
There's lots of exceptions. But so then we had family, we had employers. Employers, I think the limit is 140,000, but there's additional numbers that can be added. Next are refugees and asylees. And the difference between the two is refugees, President Obama had mentioned the U.S. will be accepting 10,000 Syrian refugees. And what that means is that they're going to be screened overseas at in Turkey or in Jordan or a third country, and then they'll be brought to the States. And so they're essentially vetted before they come. An asylee is somebody who gets to the States and then applies for asylum. And it's possible that they got here, they came as a student, but they're from Syria, and now the place is a nightmare. Their hometown is occupied by ISIS or whatever, and they're applying for asylum on their own, but here in the States. For refugees, that money is there is money that's allocated by Congress. What happens is the president will propose a number and divide by different regions. And for most of the past decade, that's been about 70,000 people total, and Congress will decide what they want to fund. And then those people will be brought. Asylees, there's no numerical limit, but it's usually less than the number of refugees.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. First of all, what if a nurse is watching the show and she's unemployed and she's thinking, well, you're getting nurses from other countries, but I don't have a job and I'm a nurse. Okay, so how does that employer prove that they've done a national search for nurses and came up empty?
They're supposed to show that they have advertised the position and that they've offered prevailing wage for that position. So, for instance, if you're going to have a position for a neurosurgeon in Houston, and starting wage typically, if you do a survey of neurosurgeons, is $225,000, you can't say, we're going to be paying $50,000.
Right.
You have to show that when you advertise, and that has to be shown to the satisfaction of the Department of Labor. So that's part of that process with the with what's called a labor certification. You have to show that, that you've advertised. You have to show the publication, or you've put it on monster.com or whatever the service is where you've posted it. That has to be shown as part of that.
Okay. And the other question is, when you, in your case, with the cases that you work here, what's the cultural percentage of immigrants? I mean, is there, because most people think that there's a disparity in maybe Haitian refugees as opposed to what we're going to bring in from Syria, although we know that Haiti has many, many issues and people seek asylum. So kind of clear that up, or tell me, give me your perspective. Or
Sure. Okay, so we're located, our East Side office is located in Southwest Detroit. So most of the people we see are Latino immigrants. Most of them are Mexican. We have a few folks from Dominican Republic, Central America, but far and away Mexico is the most common country because there is kind of a geographic, orientation. If you go a little farther south from where we are, a lot of Middle Easterners. You get into Dearborn, and you have a large Yemeni population, Lebanese, Jordanian, folks from those countries. There's another organization that used to host us, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, or ACCESS. They tend to see a lot of the folks from the Middle East. If you go farther north from us, you go to Hamtramck, you'll find Bangladeshi. You also find there's a small groups of African diaspora. So Senegal is one of the countries that there's an organization that we work with. And so we're often doing presentations for those folks. If you go towards the west of where we are, you have, and I haven't even mentioned the Chaldeans from Iraq, who are to our north, and usually they're well served by the Chaldean Community Foundation. If you go west to like Lansing, they've received as refugees Vietnamese. They have a small Hispanic population, mostly Mexican. You go farther west, there are Burmese refugees. You also find folks from India and from the suburbs of Detroit across to the west. And then you also find in West Michigan, again, Latino immigrants, many of whom came originally to work in migrant labor and have shifted to other kinds of work.
Okay. So when you come in, say you come in as a migrant worker, okay, and then after that you shift to another type of employment, are you here on a work permit?
It depends on the person. So some people will enter with like a seasonal, I think it's an H-2A or an H-2B, seasonal agricultural worker visa. I'm not as well versed on the nomenclature of those, because I'm in nonprofit. So
okay.
That's mostly the for-profit folks do those. But usually you're in for a period of like 3 to 6 months, whatever the season of the crop that you're working with, or it may be longer if you're working with animals, for example. You might be doing things, but in general, my understanding is that goes to crop harvest when it's harvesting time, usually fruits and vegetables and other kinds of things that have to be handpicked. It may be possible to transfer from that visa to another visa if you're qualified. That's called a change of status. If you're changing from one temporary visa to another. Some folks will be coming undocumented, and they'll be working, picking crops without any status. And so what had happened, though, is that there was a lot of fear in West Michigan of getting picked up, and so people wanted stuff that was more work that was less dangerous with respect to being picked up by immigration. And so that's, people have worked in either for an individual farm or a restaurant, light construction or something like that.
Okay. So my question now is, when you come in with a valid work permit to do crops and seasonal, is the pay different? Are you paying taxes?
Yeah, you would be paying a certain level of taxes. You would file a return that would be a 1040 NR, non-resident, so that there's a certain amount of taxes that would be reimbursed because you don't live here year round.
Okay.
We're kind of venturing out into the wilderness.
No,
for
and the
my
reason, okay, and that's okay. Just say Claudette, and just like you're doing. I don't know, but there is I think, because I guess my question is, and I'm going to ask you this also, as far as what do we do with the borders? Because you work with immigration and there's always a thing to close the borders, more border security, undocumented come in, to work here and seek benefits of refuge, So what do we do about the border situation?
So the question for our times. In general, the issue is, what does the country want? And there's a big tangle of things on that. In my opinion, I think we should focus on security, and security doesn't always mean just building some, just general wall, right? What they talk about is, if you build a 20-foot wall, then somebody else on the other side selling 21-foot ladders. The question is, we want to make sure that the most dangerous and harmful people are kept out. We have the Border Patrol is now larger than it's ever been in our history. In 1992, the Border Patrol was around 5,000 agents in the field, right? Not human resources personnel or things like that, but agents in the field. It was doubled with the 1996 Immigration Act to 10,000 in 96. And then another 5,000 was added, and then another 5,000 was added. So we're actually over 20,000 total border agents. And so I think we have a decent amount of people, and at the same time, apprehensions have dropped from the year 2000 through most of, I'd say, until about 2012, 2013. Total apprehensions were something like, I think in 2000 it was around 1.6 million, and now it's below 500,000. So that's, if you imagine the the doubling of agents, and at the same time you have basically 1/4 of the number of apprehensions happening, right? So that means that there is some change going on there. But at the same time, if you want to know everybody who's in the country, right, then I think it's important that you have a process where people can come in. Of the undocumented population, which the number that's usually mentioned is somewhere between 10.8 to 11.1 million people. Although, I think there are some organizations, some nativist organizations, that'll say it's 30 million. But I don't have any. I haven't seen anything that warrants that accounting. But regardless, I'd say at least 1 million. And this is just anecdotal evidence of the number of people who come to our organization, and my history in the past 10 or 15 years, are people who are they're married to citizens or they're married to permanent residents, but they're stuck. In part because, that person can file a petition, but because they've been here out of status, if they leave, they trigger a 10-year bar to coming back, right? And in some cases, they'll be eligible for a waiver of that 10-year bar. So if they are, and you want it to be successful, you're probably paying a lawyer. And if you're lucky, you get a good lawyer who doesn't charge much, and not much would be $2,500 for for purposes of one of those waivers. Reasonable would be 5,000, and you might see people at 7,500, and hopefully they've done a good job, and you get that waiver approved. But there is a lot of fear, right, from people. They have their families together, even though one parent is out of status, and lots of times they're saying, I'd rather just do this and not take the chance, because we just don't know what's happening. Now, a couple of things that have happened have been some changes in the regulations, so that you can get a sort of a preliminary opinion on that waiver before you actually leave the country. Because most of these people will have to leave the country and apply at the U.S. consulate overseas. They're not eligible to do it stateside.
Oh, okay.
And that's how all of this gets complicated. But that's definitely a big issue in any community that has people who are out of status. And whether that's Mexican or Korean or Bangladeshi, Haitian, Cuban, if they have to travel in order to get their status, then there's always a risk, right, with this travel activating this bar. Some people may have traveled because they had an ailing relative. One of their parents was ill. They went to see them. They activated the 10-year bar. Then they came back in illegally, and they've activated a permanent bar. And so then that person is only eligible to waive the permanent bar by leaving the country for 10 years. And then they can apply, right? So there's a lot of these things that have sort of stranded families in this kind of, limbo. And I would say that if there were, in my personal opinion, is at least 1 million of the undocumented are otherwise able to immigrate, except for this issue of the weight of their having been here unlawfully. Even though they have U.S. citizen children, they have a U.S. citizen spouse or permanent resident spouse, this is part of what's this movement is part of what's created the problem.
But you have to leave in order to come back.
In most cases.
Okay.
And often that is an issue economically, right? So if people have entered with a visa, with a non-immigrant visa, and they are in a particular family class, so and I'm using this as a term of art, right? It's a common term, but
okay.
Immigration defines immediate relative as the spouse of a citizen, the minor unmarried child of a citizen, or the parent of an adult citizen. Just those three relationships under the immigration law constitute immediate relatives. So for instance, the spouse of a permanent resident is not an immediate relative. Okay, welcome to my world, right? This is the mind-bending, right, but the reason I bring this up is if you fall into that category of immediate relative and you've entered with some sort of temporary visa, you can then, instead of having to go home, even if you've lapsed out of status, you may be eligible for what's called adjustment of status. So you can do it all in the States. You'd go to an interview at USCIS, and it would all be taken care of here. But it depends on your community and how it is you got here in the first place, whether you're going to have to travel back or whether you have the privilege of doing it stateside.
Okay, so I need you to back up so people don't have to rewind their tape, okay? Give me, we know the permanent and the spouse, it's not included. Give me the three again.
Okay, it is the spouse of a U.S. citizen, minor unmarried child of a U.S. citizen. And when we say minor in this section of the law, it's under 21. And then adult child, the parent of an adult U.S. citizen. So that's where the child of the U.S. citizen child is 21 or older.
Okay.
Those three relationships.
So that gets kind of So have we tried to change that?
There have been numerous, immigration law is, when I hear other lawyers talk about it, actually I'm not a lawyer, I'm licensed by the Board of Immigration Appeals, but I'm an accredited representative. When I hear lawyers talking about it, particularly in law schools, professors and such, they compare immigration law to tax law. And tax law gets changed. Often there's little tweaks or things put in. Unfortunately, most of the changes have been, either penalties or restrictions or other things like that. So we've had the 3 laws in 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, the Welfare Bill, the Anti-Terrorism Bill, all had important immigration conditions in them. You have the Real ID Act of 2005. There's a lot of these laws that were passed that put restrictions or penalties on folks. There are some laws that have affected particular populations. So, for instance, the Haitian Refugee and Immigrant Fairness Act of '98, which allowed some of the Haitians who came in after the coup against Aristide in the early '90s, those people who were screened at Guantanamo and then were brought to the States, were about 40,000, they were allowed to ultimately apply for permanent residence. But they had to meet those conditions, right? So a Haitian coming in today, in general, would not be eligible under that law. There was another, in 2000, there was a rewrite of the Violence Against Women Act, and there was the creation of the U visa. So the Violence Against Women Act is really a subset of the family provisions, but in a situation where there's an abusive relationship, either by the citizen or the permanent resident, spouse or parent or step-parent, when that person is being abusive, either to the children in the relationship or the immigrant spouse, the spouse can self-petition, right? As long as she or he, I don't know how common that is, but it's mostly women. But if she can prove that the marriage was entered into in good faith, and that there has been either physical or mental abuse or cruelty to herself or to the children in the relationship, then she doesn't need his permission, the abuser's permission, to file a petition. Right? So that's something that was pioneered in the 90s. It was rewritten in 2000. And then there's the U visa, which is for victims of violence, victims of particular crimes, excuse me. So people who have been in certain victims of exploitative crimes, whether it's prostitution, trafficking, forced labor, peonage, extortion, these kind of things, those people may be eligible. And if they have assisted the police in investigating, if they've given testimony, that sort of thing, they may be able to apply for a visa. But in terms of like a general category.
Okay, I want to stop.
Okay.
Because I have never heard of a person that, say, is in Sudan and is getting, has a domestic violence situation, able to apply. So I'm thinking that if I've never heard of it, then a lot of my audience has never heard of it. So I need you to go into that a little bit more.
Very good.
Okay.
So in general, this is really going to apply to people already in the States.
Okay.
Right? And the abuser has to be a citizen or a resident, right? And either the spouse of the immigrant, in most cases the spouse of the immigrant, the person receiving the abuse does not have to be the spouse, the immigrant spouse. It could be the children in the relationship. But the reason this law was created is that there was a long-held, not just belief, but proven that you had some people who would marry an immigrant, especially to be able to have somebody they could control. And the carrot was a green card, and the stick was deportation, right, in order to control the behavior of the immigrant spouse. And so they created this law in '94 originally. In fact, I think Joe Biden was a key sponsor when he was a senator. And then there were changes made in 2000 because so for example, I remember speaking to a woman who had been married to a man who she discovered had been married 4 times before her, but had never gotten a divorce. So only the first marriage was actually valid.
Right.
Right. Under the '94 the law, she couldn't do it because it wasn't a legally valid marriage. With the 2000 law, so long as the person entered the marriage into good faith and had a genuine belief that it was a lawful marriage, that's all she has to prove in order to qualify for this law.
Okay, stop. What if, because I know this personally in cases, there's an exchange of money for the relationship, the green card. Is that different?
Well, okay. So if it's what we call a paper marriage, right? And I'm going off the top of my head, so
okay.
I don't have the perfect legal answer, but my hunch is probably not.
Okay.
If it was a fraudulent relationship to begin with. Actually, sorry, I can say that definitively. If it was not a good, because it has to be a good faith marriage.
Right.
Right? If you're doing the marriage just to get your papers, that's not a good faith marriage.
Okay.
So
I had good faith that you were going to pay me, but it's not going to get you.
Yeah.
Okay. I like to stop so
Okay.
I can clarify.
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
All right. So we talked about that particular issue. Now, I want you to go over 3 case scenarios.
Okay.
Okay? So that, people watching can see if it kind of fits their situation or what their, remedies are.
Okay.
Okay. So you tell me like 3 unique case scenarios. And of
Okay.
course, if I need to stop you, I'll say okay.
Okay. So one that we've sort of touched on is you have a family where what we call a mixed status family. One spouse, perhaps, and the kids, or most of the kids, are citizens or residents. And one of the parents, and maybe the older kids, don't have status, right? And so if that person entered illegally, the challenge they have is that 10-year bar, right? So you have this family who's got somebody who's undocumented, and their fear is going back, triggering that bar, and being denied at the U.S. consulate, and being stuck, right? And the family being
Right.
separated. So that's one challenge. They're otherwise eligible to immigrate. That 10-year bar is a problem. Let's move to another example, is where you have a person, they have a petitioner. And this is another family example. But the line is long. So what happens is, I mentioned before immediate relatives, those 3 relationships, right? Spouse, parent, and child of a citizen. Other relationships are covered in what's called a preference system. And the big difference is that the preference system has caps. They have a limit on the number of visas they're going to give out every year in those categories. And in some cases, there's a backlog that goes back more than a decade. So you have some people who, they're like the cartoon with the cobwebs growing off them and the dust collecting on them as they're waiting to be able to immigrate. And that's because they limit the number of visas, right? So that's another type of challenge for some of the families.
Is money an issue? If I have more money, can I get one quicker?
Money is definitely, so I mentioned earlier, like the people who have to deal with that waiver, they're talking just in lawyers' fees, $5,000, $7,500. If you've got a lot of money, you can have a good chance at writing your ticket. If you invest $1 million in the United States in an enterprise that will create 10 new jobs, known as an investor visa, then you can immigrate on that basis. If you are going to invest in what's defined as under the law as an economically depressed area, you can the amount of money you invest can go down to $500,000, but you would still have to generate 10 jobs.
Okay.
So there are people with wealth. There are different doors, right, for those folks coming into the
Just like the
country.
United States.
Yeah.
So it can be about money.
There are occasions. Now it's not. I wouldn't say that's the largest part, right?
Right.
The largest, that's for the small, a small percentage.
Right. Just like in the United States. There's, 2%?
Yeah.
And there's probably 2%.
And the rest
right,
of us, yeah.
who have to wait, right, to go through the process?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want you to, I'm going to let you do an explanation. I know we talked about this
Okay.
prior to, and you wanted to give me an explanation. I'm going to allow you to give that explanation. Grade President Obama's, his immigration reform policy from, I guess, we would look at the beginning, 2008, and grade him.
I think it would be around a C, right? I mean, in terms of, now, as we discussed, I feel part of it was held to political positions that really don't have to do with immigration, but with influence and power between the two parties, right? Between a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House. But at the same time, it wasn't his chief objective, and most of the things that he's been able to do have been administrative or executive. And so some of them are positive, but he's also known as the president who has deported more people than anybody else. It's over 2 million people have been deported during his administration. So that's that, and not being able to get the immigration reform past the goal line. I think it was S-744, Senate bill, passed the Senate. It was bipartisan. Now it was bipartisan because there were some important Republican leaders working on it. I wouldn't say that it was like 50-50 Democrats, Republicans. That did pass the Senate in 2013 and got nowhere in the House. And there wasn't any sort of repercussion, but what President Obama did do is he went ahead and put out last year the deferred action for parental arrivals, and now that's strung up in a lawsuit called Texas v. U.S. And that was similar to what I mentioned before as deferred action for childhood arrivals. It was sort of a parallel, but for people who have children who are born here or are permanent residents. So that's been strung up, also along political lines. It has some other positives, including these changes to the granting, the process for the waiver of people who face the 10-year bar, other things like that. So there have been some decent administrative changes, but I don't think he's done, and he's, in terms of the bully pulpit, he's been positive in terms of his discussions of immigrants. But he hasn't done a huge change, right? Like for instance, getting immigration reform that's decent, that would positively impact a lot of people, I think that would be something that would be in the A range. And so I would put him in C, around there.
Okay. And we've all, looked at the potential candidates on the Republican side. Is there a Republican that you feel has a solid plan and that can move from the goal line?
That's a great question. the ones who have seemed most open, right? Because most of the folks, I mean, obviously the Donald is the one that everybody's going to mention, right? He's he's drug dealers, rapists, and some of them are good people, right? He's referring to Mexicans. A lot of people got behind him on that. Other candidates, I mean. The ones who didn't, so Jeb Bush has talked, and he's, we were also talking about Flippy Floppy, right?
And how he actually voted or during his administration,
He's vacillated, right? He hasn't stood as firm, but he at least professes, in spite of the rush towards the Donald earlier on. He has at least professed a positive attitude towards immigrants. So is Marco Rubio, and to some degree John Kasich, the former governor of Ohio. Those are the three that seem the most positive. Now I'm not familiar with everybody's. Right. Lindsey Graham had been part of the group of 8 that helped pass S-744 in 2013. But he hasn't gotten as much airtime, right? In fact, I remember seeing him more often on the Sunday talk shows before he ran for president than I have now. He's been at kind of the bottom of the pack, and so it's possible that I'm just not getting the message. But he had previously been, had a positive attitude and was taking steps. Marco Rubio was also part of the group of 8. But Lindsey Graham was more kind of like the old hand, right? Ted Cruz doesn't seem to hold, he seems to have a pretty fiercely, I'm not saying he's necessarily talking about immigrants the same way Donald Trump is, but I do think he has a throw 'em out attitude. Rick Perry had been, as a governor, he had signed a in-state tuition bill that would allow undocumented immigrants to qualify for in-state tuition if they had been living and paying taxes for a certain period in Texas. But then once he got into the campaign trail for the White House, he tacked, kind of in the nativist direction. But he's already retired, right? Gilmore's retired. Pulled out of the race. I'm not sure where Carly Fiorina is. I also don't know where Ben Carson is on the immigration
Ben
issue.
Carson sounds, he's very favorable. He's moral. He has a moralistic approach to the entire situation. From what I've read, and I am not familiar with Carly yet, because when I looked at the position of everybody and then I listened to what they had to say, that information was not available to me as of yet. So I don't know. I have looked at Clinton and Bernie Sanders. So what are you thinking about former Secretary of State?
Well, she's, and as we were discussing before, she's gone both ways, right? And her husband signed, and maybe the sins of her husband shouldn't be visited on her, but he signed these 3 laws in '96 that created the 10-year bar, for example, that we were talking about earlier. And she signed the Real ID. She started tacking towards immigrants actually in the 2008 campaign. And she was in a debate in Iowa where she mentioned driver's licenses and why. So this was separate from really her Senate career, right? So here she was no longer senator, and she was running, and she got piled on for that one. And in some ways because it wasn't enough, and in other ways, I think it was across the aisle they were saying, well, that's just stupid. There's quite often an association that Americans have of the driver's license being your proof that you're an American, right? And in a cultural sense, it is, right? But it's not. It's a driving permit that we use as an identification, but it's not actually proof of your citizenship. But there was a lot of conflation on that. Anyway, so I think, in the Senate she was a bit more hardline, and before that you have what Bill Clinton did, but she has been warming towards immigrants. The issue is how, right? Then the questions like how committed she is to it.
Is she warming because she's running? And I asked that question about not only, former Senator Clinton. I asked it about all of the candidates. That's why we're having this discussion, because they vacillated back and forth. And, nobody has changed as quick as the Donald, but,
Well, he didn't. I think you need Stephen Hawking to explain the Donald, right? The question is, and this is actually for all of us. Whoever gets elected, can we hold them accountable to what they've said? President Obama was not really making any moves towards deferred action until the pressure started ramping up, right? It was 2012. No real bill had moved. There had been a couple of votes, I think in 2009 and 2010, but we were pushing for that to go forward, and it took people. Going to his campaign offices and demonstrating in front of him and doing civil disobedience in front of the White House and all sorts of things, till ultimately he came out with the deferred action, right? So in the same way we'd have to do for the rest of the pack, whoever does get elected. I'd say that the infrastructure that some of these candidates bring with them will tilt towards immigrants. And so I think, I haven't heard, I've heard, kind of at least niceties coming out of Bernie Sanders. Heard some positive things coming out of Martin O'Malley, the governor of Maryland? Yeah. Don't know about Lincoln Chafee. Joe Biden has spoken well, but as vice president,
he has no power.
Yeah, right. And honestly, I don't think he's going to run. I think the death of his son is kind of. I really don't see him hopping into the race. So I think in general, the folks who would be in those administrations would tilt towards immigrants. On the Republican side, it's much more varied in terms of like the attitude of the quote unquote the troops they lead, the people who would staff their administrations. And I think there's, like you look at the Federalists, that this group, this group of legal scholars who essentially are very strict. They say that if it is not a right enshrined in the Constitution, then it is a privilege, and you don't have a right to it, right? And so they're very strict on their when they look at the law vis-a-vis immigration.
Okay, we've got to wrap it up.
Oh, kiddoke.
And it's been a pleasure to have you here. Because you worked with my pauses and my questions, but I like to get them in quickly. I want you to give the website for your organization. Go ahead and do that.
And that's www.miunited.org.
Okay. And again, this is Claudette Milner for A Matter of Interpretation. We've been talking about immigration. We're going to continue to talk about immigration. We're going to show some of the faces of immigration. And of course, as I always say, my efforts plus God's grace. You have a blessed week. Bye-bye.